I didn't think a single piece of paper could destroy someone's entire world until I watched my sister's face drain of color as she read the clause that would change everything. But let me back up, because this story starts long before that moment, in a place where the smell of coffee and bacon grease became the soundtrack to my supposed failure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maya Chen, and for 3 years I served tables at Riverside Diner on the outskirts of Portland. Not the trendy part of Portland with the food trucks and artisan everything, but the stretch of highway where truckers stopped for pie and lonely people nursed coffee until closing time. My uniform was always stained by the end of my shift. My feet ached in those non-slip shoes, and my hands smelled like industrial dish soap no matter how much lotion I used. To most people walking by, I was invisible. To my family, I was an embarrassment. My sister Victoria had made that crystal clear at every family gathering for the past 5 years. Victoria, with her corner office at Morrison & Associates, her luxury condo in the Pearl District, and her ability to make our parents beam with pride every time she walked into a room. She had the kind of success that came with business cards, expense accounts, and a wardrobe that cost more than I made in 3 months. She also had the kind of cruelty that only family members can perfect, the surgical precision of knowing exactly where to cut deepest. It was a Thursday evening in late September, when Victoria decided to twist the knife one more time. Our parents had invited us both over for what they called a casual family dinner, which really meant an opportunity for Victoria to showcase her latest achievements, while I tried to blend into the wallpaper. I had just finished a double shift and barely had time to change out of my uniform before driving to their house in Lake Oswego, the kind of neighborhood where even the mailboxes looked expensive. Victoria was already there when I arrived, of course, perched on the living room couch like she owned the place, her perfectly blown-out hair catching the light from the crystal chandelier. She was wearing what I later learned was a $2,000 blazer, the kind of thing I could never afford, even if I saved every tip for 6 months. Our parents were hanging on her every word, as she described some merger she had helped facilitate, their faces glowing with the kind of pride I had never seen directed at me. And then, Victoria was saying, gesturing with her wine glass, the client actually thanked me personally for saving the deal. He said I was the most brilliant legal mind he'd worked with in 20 years. She paused for effect, letting the praise sink in before taking a delicate sip of the expensive Bordeaux our father had opened specifically for her visit. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," our mother gushed, reaching over to squeeze Victoria's hand. "We're so proud of everything you've accomplished. A senior associate at your age. It's just incredible." I slipped into the dining room as quietly as possible, hoping to avoid the inevitable comparison that always followed Victoria's success stories. But my sister had radar for these moments, the times when she could position herself as the golden child, while simultaneously positioning me as the disappointment. "Oh, Maya's here," Victoria announced, as if she had just noticed me, though I was certain she had seen me come in. "How was work today? Did you remember to smile when you asked if they wanted fries with that?" The comment hit exactly where she intended it to. Not technically mean enough for our parents to intervene, but cruel enough to make me feel small. I had heard variations of this joke dozens of times over the years, each one delivered with the same practiced sweetness that made objecting seem like overreacting. "It's actually a diner, not fast food," I said quietly, taking my usual seat at the far end of the table. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "And it was fine, thanks for asking." Victoria's laugh was like wind chimes in a hurricane, pretty and sharp. "Right, sorry. How was your day bringing people coffee and wiping down tables? Better?" Our father cleared his throat uncomfortably, but he didn't say anything. He never did. In his mind, Victoria's success justified her attitude, and my lack of traditional achievement meant I should be grateful for any attention at all, even the cruel kind. "Victoria," our mother said mildly, "that's not very nice." "I'm just teasing," Victoria replied, but her eyes never left mine. "Maya knows I don't mean anything by it. We can't all be lawyers, right? Someone has to serve the coffee." The dinner continued, with Victoria regaling our parents with stories from her sophisticated world while I picked at my food and tried to disappear. She talked about client dinners at restaurants where the appetizers cost more than my daily wage. About business trips to New York and San Francisco. About the partnership track she was on, and the corner office she would eventually inherit. Each story was a reminder of the distance between us, the gap that seemed to grow wider every time we were in the same room. But it was after dinner, when we were clearing the table, that Victoria delivered the blow that would change everything between us. Our parents had gone into the living room to set up the coffee service, leaving us alone in the kitchen with the dishes and the weight of years of unspoken resentment. "You know, Maya," Victoria said, rinsing a wine glass with the careful attention of someone who had never actually had to do dishes regularly, "I was talking to some colleagues about you the other day." I looked up from loading the dishwasher, surprised. Victoria never talked about me to her colleagues. In her professional world, I didn't exist. "Really?" I asked, though something in her tone made me immediately regret showing interest. She hummed, setting the glass in the drying rack with deliberate precision. We were discussing career trajectories, and someone mentioned how some people just aren't built for success. They're more comfortable in service positions. She paused, letting the word hang in the air like smoke. I told them about my sister, how you've been waitressing for years now, and they said it made perfect sense. Some people are just meant to serve others. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Not just the content of what she was saying, but the fact that she had used me as an example of failure to entertain her professional friends. I was a cautionary tale she told at networking events, a punchline to make herself look better by comparison. "I work hard," I said quietly, my hands still submerged in the soapy water. "There's nothing wrong with honest work." Victoria's laugh was soft and condescending. "Of course there isn't. And you're very good at it, I'm sure. It's just that some of us were meant for bigger things." She leaned against the counter, studying me with the kind of clinical interest a scientist might show a particularly interesting specimen. "I mean, look at us. Same parents, same upbringing, same opportunities. But here you are, still asking, 'Can I take your order?' while I'm negotiating million-dollar deals." "We didn't have the same opportunities," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "You went to law school. Mom and Dad paid for everything." "Because I earned it," Victoria shot back, her mask slipping just slightly to reveal the sharp edges underneath. "I had the grades, the ambition, the drive. You had—" "What?" "A liberal arts degree you've never used, and a series of dead-end jobs." The words stung, because there was just enough truth in them to make me doubt myself. I had graduated with a degree in English literature, full of dreams about writing and teaching and making a difference in the world. But life had gotten in the way, as it often does, and those dreams had been shelved in favor of paying rent and student loans and all the mundane necessities that don't care about your aspirations. "Maybe if you had supported me instead of tearing me down every chance you got, things would be different," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. Victoria's eyes widened in mock surprise. "Supported you?" "Maya, I've been trying to motivate you for years. Sometimes people need to hear hard truths about their limitations. I can't help it if you're too sensitive to handle honest feedback." That was Victoria's specialty, weaponizing honesty. She could say the cruelest things and then act like the victim when anyone objected, claiming she was just being real, just trying to help, just telling it like it is. It was psychological warfare disguised as sisterly concern. "Besides," she continued, warming to her theme, "there's nothing wrong with being a waitress. It's just not what I would call a career. It's more like a placeholder. Something you do while you figure out what you actually want to be when you grow up." I dried my hands on the dish towel, taking my time, trying to find the words that would express the years of accumulated hurt and frustration. But before I could respond, our parents returned to the kitchen, all smiles and oblivious to the tension crackling between their daughters. "Girls, we're thinking of having coffee in the living room," our mother announced. "Maya, would you mind bringing the cream and sugar? You're so good at that sort of thing." Even our mother's compliment was a backhanded reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. I was the one who carried things, who served, who made everyone else comfortable while my own comfort was never considered. Victoria sailed past me toward the living room, pausing just long enough to whisper, "See? Even Mom knows what you're good at." I spent the rest of the evening listening to more stories about Victoria's professional triumphs, while I served coffee and cleared cups, and tried to make myself small enough to disappear entirely. When I finally left their house that night, Victoria's words echoed in my head like a song I couldn't shake. Some people are just meant to serve others. A placeholder. Just a waitress. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of streetlights and self-doubt. I lived in a studio in southeast Portland, the kind of place where the neighbors were either struggling artists or people who had given up on struggling altogether. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Paid for with tips and wages from a job that Victoria considered beneath dignity. I sat in my car outside my building for a long time that night, staring up at the lit windows of other people's lives. In some of them, I could see the blue glow of television screens, the warm yellow light of table lamps, the suggestion of comfortable domestic scenes that felt as foreign to me as another planet. I thought about Victoria in her luxury condo, probably settling in with another glass of expensive wine and the satisfaction of having put me in my place once again. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the clinical way she had discussed my failures with her colleagues, turning my struggles into entertainment for people who didn't even know me. Maybe it was the realization that she saw me not as a sister who had taken a different path, but as a cautionary tale to make herself feel superior. Or maybe it was just that I had finally reached the limit of how small I was willing to make myself to accommodate someone else's need to feel big. Whatever it was, I felt something shift inside me that night, like a door that had been locked for years suddenly clicking open. I was tired of being Victoria's example of everything she wasn't. Tired of being the measuring stick that made her success feel more impressive by comparison. I was tired of apologizing for my choices and defending my worth to people who had already decided I didn't have any. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. I made coffee in my tiny kitchen, the same cheap brand I had been buying for months, but somehow it tasted different. Less bitter, maybe, or maybe I was just drinking it with different expectations. I had 2 hours before my shift at the diner, and instead of spending them scrolling through social media or watching reruns on my laptop, I found myself pulling out a box I hadn't opened in over a year. Inside were papers from my grandfather's estate, documents I had been meaning to sort through but never quite found the time or emotional energy to tackle. My grandfather, my mother's father, had died 18 months earlier, and while most of his assets had been distributed quickly and efficiently by the family lawyer, there had been a few boxes of personal papers that no one seemed particularly interested in claiming. I had volunteered to take them, partly out of genuine sentiment and partly because no one else wanted the responsibility. Most of the contents were exactly what you would expect from a man who had lived through the Depression and World War II and the economic boom that followed. Bank statements from the 1960s, insurance policies that had long since expired, letters from friends who had passed away decades earlier. But buried near the bottom of the box, wrapped in a manila envelope that had yellowed with age, was something I had never seen before. It was a partnership agreement dated 1962 between my grandfather and a man named Harold Morrison. The name caught my attention immediately because Morrison was the same name as the law firm where Victoria worked, Morrison and Associates. I read through the document slowly, my legal knowledge limited, but my curiosity growing with each paragraph. According to the agreement, my grandfather and Harold Morrison had entered into a partnership to develop a piece of property on the outskirts of Portland. The land, which had been considered practically worthless in 1962, was now some of the most valuable commercial real estate in the city. The document outlined the terms of their partnership, including a clause that made my hands shake as I read it. In the event that Harold Morrison or his descendants wished to dissolve the partnership or sell their interest in the property, my grandfather or his descendants would have the right of first refusal, as well as the right to purchase Morrison's share at the original 1962 valuation, plus a modest annual increase tied to the Consumer Price Index. I read the clause 3 times, certain I must be misunderstanding something. But the language was clear, written in the precise legal terminology that left no room for interpretation. If this document was legitimate, and if Harold Morrison was indeed the founder of Morrison and Associates, then Victoria's law firm was built on land that my family had a legal claim to. My first instinct was to dismiss it as too good to be true, the kind of thing that only happened in movies or novels. But as I continued reading, I found supporting documents that made my heart race. Surveys of the property, correspondence between my grandfather and Morrison, and most importantly, a copy of the original deed that clearly established the partnership. I spent the rest of my morning researching Harold Morrison online, and what I found made me dizzy with possibility. He had indeed founded Morrison & Associates in 1965, 3 years after entering into the partnership with my grandfather. The law firm's main office was located on the exact piece of property described in the partnership agreement, property that was now worth millions of dollars. By the time I had to leave for my shift at the diner, I had filled a notebook with research and cross-references. The partnership agreement appeared to be completely legitimate, and if my grandfather's rights under the contract had been properly inherited, then I had a legal claim that could change everything. But I didn't want to get ahead of myself. I needed to verify the documents, understand my legal options, and figure out the best way to proceed. Most importantly, I needed to do all of this without alerting Victoria or anyone else in my family until I was certain of my position. My shift at the diner that day passed in a haze of coffee refills and sandwich orders, but my mind was elsewhere, turning over the implications of what I had discovered. Every time someone called me hon or sweetie or left exact change without a tip, I thought about Victoria's words from the night before. Some people are just meant to serve others. A placeholder. Just a waitress. But maybe, just maybe, I was about to prove that some waitresses had surprises of their own. The next 3 weeks passed like I was living in 2 different worlds. During the day, I served coffee and wiped down tables at Riverside Diner, smiling at customers and pretending everything was normal. But every spare moment was consumed with research, phone calls, and document verification that slowly painted a picture I could barely believe. I started with the Portland County Records Office, a concrete building downtown that smelled like old paper and bureaucratic indifference. The clerk, a woman with gray hair and bifocals who looked like she had been stamping documents since the Eisenhower administration, initially seemed skeptical of my request. But when I showed her the property description from my grandfather's partnership agreement, her expression shifted. "This is Morrison Plaza," she said, adjusting her glasses to read the coordinates more carefully. "That's some of the most valuable commercial real estate in the city." She disappeared into the back room for what felt like hours, returning with a thick file that she handled with the reverence usually reserved for ancient manuscripts. Inside were the original property records, going back to when the land was nothing but scrub brush and optimistic speculation. The partnership between my grandfather and Harold Morrison was right there, officially recorded and notarized, as real as the ground beneath the gleaming office towers that now occupied the space. But the records also revealed something else. Something that made my stomach twist with a mixture of excitement and dread. Harold Morrison had died in 1998, and his son Richard had inherited his share of the partnership. Richard Morrison was the current senior partner at Morrison & Associates, which meant he was Victoria's boss. The implications hit me like a freight train. Victoria had been working for years at a firm built on land that my family had a legal claim to, completely unaware that her little sister, the one she dismissed as just a waitress, might hold the key to her professional future. I spent my lunch breaks at the Central Library, hunched over legal databases and property law textbooks, trying to understand the full scope of what I had discovered. The partnership agreement was ironclad, written by lawyers who understood the value of precision. The right of first refusal was clear, and the valuation clause was so specific that there was no room for interpretation. According to my calculations, based on the original 1962 valuation and the consumer price index adjustments specified in the contract, I could potentially purchase Richard Morrison's 50% share of the property for roughly $200,000. The current market value of that same share was somewhere north of $15 million. But understanding my rights and exercising them were 2 different things entirely. I needed legal representation, and good lawyers cost money I didn't have. More importantly, I needed to understand the potential consequences of what I was considering. This wasn't just about money or property rights. This was about challenging people who had built their entire professional lives on land they might not legally own. It was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after finding the documents, when I finally decided to take the next step. I had been researching lawyers who specialized in property disputes, looking for someone with the expertise to handle a case this complex, but the flexibility to work with someone whose primary asset was a collection of vintage legal documents and a burning desire for justice. I found David Chen at Chen & Associates, a small firm in Northeast Portland that specialized in property law and had a reputation for taking on cases that larger firms considered too risky or unprofitable. The fact that he shared my last name felt like a good omen, though we weren't related as far as I knew. His office was nothing like the gleaming corporate spaces I had imagined. It was located above a Vietnamese restaurant, accessed through a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. The waiting room was furnished with mismatched chairs and a coffee table covered in legal journals that looked like they had been read cover to cover multiple times. David Chen himself was younger than I had expected, probably in his mid-30s, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he had built his practice on hard work rather than family connections. When I explained why I was there, spreading my grandfather's documents across his desk like pieces of a puzzle, he listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification. "This is remarkable," he said finally, leaning back in his chair after examining the partnership agreement for the third time. "If these documents are legitimate, and I have no reason to believe they aren't, you have an incredibly strong case." "But?" I asked, because there was clearly a but coming. "But Morrison & Associates is one of the most powerful law firms in the city. Richard Morrison has connections throughout the legal community, and he's not going to roll over quietly when someone challenges his property rights. This will be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially very ugly." I had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed still made my chest tighten. "What would it cost?" David was quiet for a moment, studying the documents again. "Normally, a case like this would require a significant retainer, probably $50,000 minimum. But this is such an unusual situation, and the potential outcome is so significant that I might be willing to work on a contingency basis." "What does that mean?" "It means you don't pay me unless we win. If we're successful, I take a percentage of whatever settlement or judgment we obtain. If we lose, you don't owe me anything except the costs of filing fees and document preparation." The offer was more generous than I had dared to hope for, but it also underscored the magnitude of what I was considering. David wouldn't take a case on contingency unless he believed we had a real chance of winning, but it meant that if we lost, I would have gained nothing except the satisfaction of having tried. "How long would something like this take?" I asked. "Months, potentially years. Property disputes are rarely resolved quickly, especially when there's this much money involved. Morrison will fight every step of the way, and he has resources that most people can only dream of." I thought about Victoria, probably working late in her corner office at that very moment, completely unaware that her little sister was sitting in a lawyer's office planning what could be the end of her career. Part of me felt guilty for even considering it, but a larger part remembered every cruel comment, every dismissive laugh, every moment when she had made me feel worthless. "I want to do it," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. David nodded slowly. "Before we proceed, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What do you really want out of this? Is it the money? The property? Or is it something else?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on the legal mechanics of my claim that I hadn't really considered my deeper motivations. What did I want? "I want them to know," I said finally. "I want them to know that they were wrong about me, that I'm not just a waitress, not just a placeholder, not just someone who exists to make them feel better about themselves. And if you get that recognition, if you prove your point, what happens then? Are you prepared for the possibility that your family might never forgive you for this?" It was a sobering question, but the answer came without hesitation. "They've already decided I don't matter. At least this way, I'll matter to myself." David smiled for the first time since I had entered his office. "Then let's get started." Over the next 2 weeks, David and his small team worked to build our case. They verified the authenticity of every document, researched the chain of title for the property, and confirmed that my grandfather's rights under the partnership agreement had been properly inherited through my mother and then to me. The more we uncovered, the stronger our position became. Not only was the original partnership agreement legitimate, but there was evidence that Harold Morrison and his successors had been aware of the partnership throughout the years. Property tax records showed that both parties had been listed as owners, though the Morrison side had apparently been handling all the administrative responsibilities. Most damning of all was a series of letters from the 1980s, when Harold Morrison had been negotiating the development of the property into the office complex that now housed Morrison and Associates. In one of those letters, he specifically acknowledged the partnership agreement and mentioned that he would need to address the Chen family's interests before proceeding with development. But apparently, he never had. Whether through oversight, assumption, or deliberate choice, the Morrison family had proceeded with development and established their law firm on the property without ever buying out my grandfather's share or even informing him of their plans. "This is going to be bigger than I initially thought," David told me during one of our strategy sessions. "We're not just talking about current property values. We're talking about decades of rental income, development profits, and business value that was built on land they didn't fully own." The numbers were staggering. Even conservative estimates suggested that my family's claim could be worth tens of millions of dollars, representing not just the current value of the property, but years of profits that should have been shared according to the original partnership agreement. But with those potential rewards came increased risks. David warned me that Morrison and Associates would likely counterattack aggressively, challenging every aspect of our case and potentially filing their own lawsuits alleging fraud, extortion, or any other claim they could think of. "They'll try to destroy your credibility," he explained. "They'll dig into your background, your finances, your personal life, looking for anything they can use to undermine your case. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" I thought about my tiny studio apartment, my secondhand furniture, my uniform hanging in the closet that smelled perpetually of French fries and coffee. What could they find that was worse than what Victoria already said about me? "Let them look," I said. "I've got nothing to hide." It was during this period of preparation and research that I made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing the corporate filings for Morrison and Associates, David's paralegal had uncovered something interesting in the employee records. Victoria wasn't just any associate at the firm. She had been specifically recruited 2 years earlier as part of an initiative to bring in young talent with family connections to the Portland legal community. According to the internal memos that David had obtained through legal discovery requests, Victoria's hiring had been personally approved by Richard Morrison himself, who had noted in her file that her family had historical ties to the firm's founding. At the time, I had assumed this was just corporate speak, the kind of vague language that made everyone feel important. But now I understood what it really meant. Richard Morrison knew about the partnership agreement. He knew about my family's claim to the property. And he had hired Victoria anyway, possibly thinking that having a Chen family member on his payroll would complicate any future legal challenges. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Victoria, who had spent years mocking me for my lack of professional success, had gotten her dream job partly because of a family connection she didn't even know existed. The same family history that she dismissed as irrelevant had been the key to her career advancement. But there was more. As David dug deeper into the firm's financial records, he discovered that Morrison and Associates had been planning a major expansion, including the development of a second office building on the same property. The project was scheduled to break ground in 6 months, representing a $100 million investment that would cement the firm's position as one of the largest legal practices on the West Coast. All of it built on land that Richard Morrison might not actually own. "We need to move quickly," David advised. "Once they start construction, it becomes much more complicated to unwind everything. We need to file our claim and seek an injunction before they break ground." The legal papers were filed on a Wednesday morning in late October. I had taken the day off from the diner, telling my manager I had a family emergency, which felt like the most honest lie I had ever told. David and I walked into the courthouse together, carrying boxes of documents that represented months of research and preparation. The clerk who accepted our filing seemed remarkably casual about accepting papers that could potentially reshape one of Portland's most prominent law firms. She stamped the documents, assigned a case number, and handed David a receipt like we were renewing a driver's license, rather than launching a legal war. "How long before they know?" I asked as we walked back to David's car. "They'll be served within 24 hours, he replied. "After that, everything changes." That evening, I went to work at the diner like it was any other night. I served coffee to truckers and late-night shift workers, wiped down tables, and counted my tips like I had hundreds of times before. But everything felt different now. Charged with the electricity of secrets and pending revelations, I kept checking my phone, expecting calls or messages, though I wasn't sure from whom. David had warned me that once Morrison and Associates received the papers, they would likely try to contact me directly, either to negotiate or to intimidate. I should refer all communication to him and avoid discussing the case with anyone, especially my family. But as the hours passed, my phone remained silent. Whatever was happening in the gleaming offices of Morrison and Associates, it hadn't reached me yet. It was almost midnight when I finally got home to my studio apartment. I made a cup of tea and sat by my one window, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the chain of events I had set in motion. Somewhere out there, Victoria was probably sleeping peacefully in her luxury condo, completely unaware that her little sister had just filed a lawsuit that could end her career. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, the sister who had dismissed me as just a waitress would learn that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who hold the power to change your world. The call came at 7:30 the next morning, jarring me awake from the first decent sleep I had gotten in weeks. My phone buzzed against the nightstand with a number I didn't recognize, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something about the persistence of the ring made me answer. "Maya?" The voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the tremor underneath. It was Victoria. "How did you get this number?" I asked, sitting up in bed and trying to shake off the fog of sleep. "I've always had your number, Maya. We're sisters, remember?" There was something different in her tone. Something I had never heard before. Uncertainty, maybe. Or the first crack in that perfect professional facade she wore like armor. "What do you want, Victoria?" There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then, "We need to talk. Today. It's important." I glanced at the clock, calculating how much time I had before my shift at the diner. "I'm working today. Call in sick." The command in her voice was automatic, the same tone she had always used when expecting immediate compliance. But this time, something was different. This time, she was asking for something instead of just taking it. "I don't call in sick unless I'm actually sick," I said, surprised by my own steadiness. "Some of us can't afford to miss work whenever we feel like it." Another pause. "Maya, please. This is about family business. Important family business. Family business." The phrase would have been laughable if it weren't so revealing. For years, Victoria had made it clear that I wasn't really part of the family business, whatever that might be. I was the sister who served coffee while she made partner, the one who lived in studio apartments while she collected corner offices. But now, suddenly, something was family business that required my participation. "What kind of family business?" I asked, though I was fairly certain I already knew. "Not over the phone. Can you meet me for lunch?" The Heathman Hotel, 1 o'clock. The Heathman was the kind of place Victoria took clients, all mahogany paneling and crystal chandeliers, and prices that reflected the exclusivity. It was also the kind of place where she would feel comfortable and in control, surrounded by the trappings of the success she had worked so hard to achieve. "I can't afford the Heathman," I said simply. "I'm buying." The words came out quickly, like she had anticipated the objection. "Please, Maya. This is really important." There was something in her voice that I had never heard before, something that might have been desperation if I hadn't known better. Victoria didn't do desperation. She did confidence, authority, and when necessary, strategic vulnerability. But desperation was too honest, too raw, too revealing of actual need. "Fine," I said finally. 1 o'clock. I hung up without saying goodbye and stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Victoria never called me. In the 3 years since I had started working at the diner, she had probably initiated contact fewer than 5 times. and those had all been related to family obligations like birthdays or holidays. She certainly had never invited me to lunch at expensive hotels, or used words like please and important in the same sentence. The logical part of my brain knew exactly what this was about. Morrison and Associates had been served with the lawsuit papers, and Victoria had somehow found out about my connection to the case. But the part of me that still remembered being sisters, that still carried the scars from years of her casual cruelty, wondered if this might be something else. Maybe she had finally realized how her words affected me. Maybe she wanted to apologize. I called the diner and told them I had a family emergency, which was true enough in its way. My manager, a woman named Linda who had been serving coffee since before I was born, just sighed and told me to find someone to cover my shift. The diner operated on the principle that personal crises were inevitable but inconvenient, and the best you could do was minimize the disruption to everyone else. I spent the morning trying to decide what to wear to lunch with my sister. My wardrobe was limited, consisting mostly of work uniforms and casual clothes that had seen better days. But buried in the back of my closet was a navy blue dress I had bought for job interviews, back when I still believed I might use my English degree for something other than reading orders back to customers. It was simple, professional, and probably the closest thing I owned to Victoria's standard of appropriate attire. The Heathman Hotel was everything I remembered from the few times I had walked past it downtown, all understated elegance, and the kind of quiet luxury that whispered, rather than shouted about its exclusivity. The hostess at the restaurant looked me up and down with the practiced assessment of someone trained to identify who belonged and who was merely visiting. But she smiled professionally and led me to a table near the window where Victoria was already waiting. My sister looked exactly like she always did, perfectly put together in a way that suggested she had been born knowing how to coordinate accessories and apply makeup with surgical precision. Her hair was swept back in the kind of effortless chignon that probably took 30 minutes to achieve, and her burgundy suit probably cost more than I made in a month. But there was something different about her posture, a tension in her shoulders that I had never noticed before. "You look nice," she said as I sat down, and I realized it might have been the first compliment she had given me in years. "Thank you." I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Victoria had called this meeting, and I was curious to see how she would begin a conversation that we both knew wasn't really about sisterly bonding. She ordered wine, an expensive Chardonnay that she pronounced, with the casual fluency of someone who had spent years learning to navigate wine lists and impress clients. I ordered water, partly because I couldn't afford alcohol, and partly because I wanted to stay sharp for whatever was coming. "How's work?" she asked, and the question was so mundane, so normal, that it caught me off guard. "Fine. The same as always." I studied her face, looking for clues about where this was heading. "How's your work?" Victoria's smile flickered, just for a moment, like a candle in a draft. "Busy, very busy. We're working on some big cases. Lots of moving parts." She paused, taking a sip of wine that seemed more like a stalling tactic than actual enjoyment. "Actually, that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about." Here it comes, I thought. The real reason for this lunch, dressed up in small talk and expensive wine. "What about it?" Victoria set down her glass and leaned forward slightly, the gesture of someone preparing to share a confidence. "Maya, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay. Have you been in contact with any lawyers recently? Anyone asking questions about our family? About Grandpa, maybe?" The question was carefully phrased, designed to sound casual while fishing for specific information. Victoria was good at this, the strategic interrogation disguised as sisterly concern. But I had been expecting it, and I had already decided how to respond. "Why would you ask that?" "Just answer the question, please. It's important." I took a sip of water, buying time while I considered my options. I could lie, tell her I had no idea what she was talking about, and try to maintain the element of surprise. But, looking at her across the table, seeing the carefully controlled anxiety in her eyes, I realized that the surprise was already gone. She knew, or at least suspected, and this lunch was her attempt to gather intelligence about what I was planning. "Victoria, what's this really about?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that betrayed her nervousness. Then, "My firm received some legal papers yesterday. A lawsuit. Someone is claiming ownership of our property, our building, based on some old partnership agreement." That sounds complicated. It is complicated. Very complicated. The person filing the suit claims to be the descendant of someone named Chen, someone who supposedly had a business relationship with the firm's founder back in the 1960s. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart was racing. Chen is a pretty common name. Yes, it is. Victoria's eyes never left my face. But combined with the other details in the lawsuit, it seems like a pretty big coincidence that someone with our family name would be making claims about property that affects my career. The pretense was wearing thin, and we both knew it. Victoria had figured out that I was behind the lawsuit, and this lunch was her attempt to understand what I wanted and how she could stop me. But I wasn't ready to lay all my cards on the table, not yet. "Maybe you should talk to your lawyers about it," I suggested. "Isn't that what they're for?" "Maya?" Her voice was sharper now, the professional mask slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "I know it's you. The timeline, the family name, the specific property details, it's all too convenient to be coincidence. So let's skip the games and talk about what's really happening here." I set down my water glass and met her gaze directly. For years, I had looked away when she stared at me like this, had found reasons to study my hands or the floor, or anything other than the judgment in her eyes. But something had changed in the weeks since I had discovered the partnership agreement, something that made her disapproval feel less crushing and more irrelevant. "Okay," I said, "let's talk about what's really happening." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her posture shifting from interrogation to negotiation. "How much do you want?" The question was so blunt, so transactional, that it took me a moment to process what she was asking. "Excuse me? How much money will it take to make this go away?" Because we both know that's what this is really about. You found some old papers, you think you can squeeze some money out of my firm, and you're hoping I'll help you because we're family. The casual dismissal of everything I had discovered, the assumption that my motives were purely mercenary, was so perfectly Victoria that I almost laughed. Even now, faced with evidence that could destroy her career, she couldn't imagine that I might have legitimate grievances or legal rights. I was still just the greedy little sister looking for a handout. "You think this is about money? Isn't it?" Victoria's tone was matter-of-fact, like she was stating an obvious truth. "Maya, you work at a diner. You live in a studio apartment. You drive a car that's older than some of my interns. Of course this is about money." There it was, the casual cruelty I had been expecting. Even when she needed something from me. Even when she was potentially facing the biggest crisis of her professional life, Victoria couldn't resist reminding me of my place in the world. I was poor. Therefore I was desperate. Therefore I could be bought. "What if it's not about money?" I asked quietly. Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Everything is about money, Maya. The question is just how much." "Then what's your offer?" She opened her purse and pulled out a checkbook, the kind of elegant leather-bound accessory that I associated with people who wrote checks regularly enough to need something prettier than the basic versions the bank provided. She clicked open a pen and poised it over the paper like she was preparing to solve a minor inconvenience. $50,000, she said, writing the amount with confident strokes. "Cash today, if you drop the lawsuit and turn over any documents you think you have." I stared at the check, watching the ink dry on numbers that represented more money than I had ever seen at one time. $50,000 would pay off my student loans, cover my rent for years, maybe even let me go back to school or start the writing career I had abandoned. It was a fortune to someone who counted tips in quarters and bought generic groceries. But it was also an insult. Victoria had no idea what the property was actually worth, no concept of the legal claim I was making, no understanding of the decades of profits that my family might be entitled to. She was offering me $50,000 for something that could potentially be worth millions, and she was doing it with the confidence of someone who assumed I was too stupid or too desperate to know the difference. "That's generous," I said, not touching the check. "I think so. It's certainly more than most people in your situation could expect to get." People in my situation. The phrase was loaded with all of Victoria's assumptions about who I was and what I deserved. People in my situation were supposed to be grateful for scraps, supposed to accept whatever crumbs fell from the tables of their betters. What exactly is my situation? I asked. Victoria's expression shifted, becoming more patient and condescending, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. Maya, you're a single woman working a service job with no real assets or prospects. You found some old papers that you think give you a claim to valuable property, but you don't have the resources to fight a legal battle against a major law firm. You need money, and I'm offering it to you. It's a win-win situation. Except you're offering me $50,000 for something that might be worth millions. Might be worth millions. Victoria emphasized the uncertainty, the risk, the possibility that I was wrong about everything. But probably isn't. Property law is complicated, Maya. Old agreements get superseded, claims get invalidated, and even if you have some legitimate grievance, proving it in court would cost more than you could ever hope to recover. She was probably right about the complexity and the costs, but she was also revealing something else. She was scared. For all her confidence and dismissive commentary, Victoria was worried enough about my claim to offer me a significant amount of money to make it disappear. That suggested that her lawyers had told her something that had shaken her usually unflappable composure. What did your lawyers say about the documents? I asked. Victoria's pause was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. They said exactly what I'm telling you. Old claims are hard to prove, expensive to litigate, and rarely as valuable as they initially appear. But they didn't say the documents were fake. They didn't say they were real either. Victoria, what did they actually say? She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working the stem of her wineglass like a rosary. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, less certain than it had been since I arrived. They said it was complicated. They said we needed to take it seriously and explore all our options for resolution. She looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something I had never seen in her eyes before. Fear. Maya, this could really hurt people. Good people who have built their careers on work they did honestly and fairly. People like you. People like me, yes. But also support staff, paralegals, junior associates who are just starting their careers. If this lawsuit goes forward, if it's successful, it could mean layoffs, budget cuts, maybe even the firm closing entirely. It was a smart argument, an appeal to my sympathy for people who weren't responsible for whatever happened between my grandfather and Harold Morrison in 1962. But it was also a deflection from the central question of whether my claim was legitimate, and whether the Morrison family had built their success on property they didn't fully own. That's not my fault, I said. Isn't it? Victoria's mask was slipping further now, revealing the anger and desperation underneath. You're the one filing the lawsuit. You're the one who could prevent all of this by just taking the money and walking away. Or I could pursue my legal rights and see what happens. Your legal rights. Victoria's tone made it sound like a fantasy, something naive and impractical. Maya, you're a waitress. You don't have legal rights to property worth millions of dollars. You have old papers that might mean something or might mean nothing, and you're gambling your future on a case you can't afford to lose. I'm not gambling anything. I'm working with a lawyer on contingency. Victoria's eyes narrowed. What lawyer? David Chen. Never heard of him. Probably some bottom feeder who sees dollar signs and doesn't care if he destroys lives in the process. The casual dismissal of David, who had spent weeks carefully researching my case, and had been nothing but professional and ethical in his approach, crystallized something that had been building in me throughout the lunch. Victoria still saw me as the inferior sister who needed her guidance and protection, even when I was the one holding documents that could end her career. Maybe you should be more worried about your own lawyer, I said. The one who didn't catch this problem when your firm was doing due diligence on the property. Victoria's face went pale, and I realized I had struck something important. There had been due diligence when Morrison and Associates had acquired or developed the property, and somewhere in that process, someone should have discovered the partnership agreement. The fact that they hadn't suggested either incompetence or deliberate oversight, neither of which would look good if the case went to trial. Maya, please. Victoria's voice was different now, smaller, more human than I had heard it in years. I'm asking you, as your sister, to reconsider this. Take the money. Start over somewhere else. Build a life that doesn't depend on tearing down other people's lives. I looked at the check still lying on the table between us, the numbers written in Victoria's confident handwriting. $50,000. It was more money than I had ever imagined having, enough to change my life in ways that seemed impossible just a few hours earlier. But it was also the price Victoria was willing to pay to keep me in my place, to ensure that I remained the sister who served coffee while she collected corner offices. It was her final offer in a negotiation where she still believed she held all the cards. I picked up the check, and for a moment, Victoria's face relaxed with relief. But instead of putting it in my purse, I tore it in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall onto the white tablecloth like confetti. Maya, what are you doing? Something I should have done years ago, I said, standing up from the table. I'm refusing to let you buy me off. Victoria stared at the torn pieces of the check, her carefully controlled composure finally cracking completely. You have no idea what you're doing. You're going to destroy everything over some family grudge that nobody even remembers. I remember, I said quietly. I remember every time you made me feel worthless, every time you dismissed my work as meaningless, every time you treated me like an embarrassment to the family name. So this is revenge. No, I said, surprised by how calm I felt. This is justice. There's a difference. I left her sitting at the table, surrounded by the debris of her failed negotiation and the growing realization that her little sister was no longer willing to be bought, bullied, or dismissed. As I walked through the elegant lobby of the Heathman Hotel, past the mahogany paneling and crystal chandeliers that represented everything Victoria valued, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt powerful. The phone started ringing at 6 a.m, 3 days after I had walked out of the Heathman Hotel. It was my mother. Her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that suggested she had been awake for hours practicing what she was going to say. Maya, we need to talk. Your father and I are very concerned about what Victoria told us. I was still in bed, staring at the ceiling of my studio apartment, while Portland's gray morning light filtered through the thin curtains. I had been expecting this call, though I had thought it might take longer for Victoria to involve our parents in what was happening. Good morning to you too, Mom. Don't be flip with me, young lady. Victoria says you're involved in some kind of lawsuit against her firm. She says you're trying to take away her job. The accusation hung in the air between us, loaded with all the assumptions that had shaped our family dynamics for years. Victoria was the successful daughter, the one who made good decisions and deserved protection. I was the problematic one, the disappointment who could only succeed by tearing down others. Did she tell you why I'm involved in a lawsuit? She said you found some old papers and you think they entitle you to money that doesn't belong to you. She said you refused a very generous settlement offer and now you're determined to hurt innocent people. Innocent people. The phrase was interesting, implying that Victoria and her colleagues were victims of my unreasonable demands rather than beneficiaries of a property arrangement that might have been problematic from the beginning. Mom, did you know that Grandpa had a business partnership with the founder of Victoria's law firm? There was a pause, longer than I had expected. What are you talking about? Harold Morrison, the man who started Morrison and Associates. He and Grandpa were partners in developing the property where Victoria's office building now stands. I found the documents in Grandpa's papers. That's impossible. Your grandfather never mentioned anything like that. Maybe because he died before the property became valuable enough to matter. Or maybe because the Morrison family never told him what they were planning to do with the land. My mother's breathing was audible through the phone, the sound of someone trying to process information that didn't fit with their understanding of the world. Maya, even if that's true, it was 60 years ago. These things have statute of limitations. Property partnerships don't expire, Mom. If Grandpa owned half the land, then his heirs still own half the land. His heirs meaning you. His heirs meaning all of us. You. Me. Victoria. We all have a claim to whatever Grandpa was entitled to under the partnership agreement. Another pause, this one even longer. Victoria says you turned down $50,000. I did. Maya, that's more money than you've probably seen in your entire life. Why would you turn that down? The question revealed everything about how my family saw me, how they measured my worth and my needs. $50,000 seemed like a fortune to them because they assumed my aspirations were small, my dreams limited to getting by rather than getting ahead. Because it's not enough, I said simply. Not enough. Maya, you work at a diner. You live in a studio apartment. $50,000 could change your entire life. You're right, it could, but not as much as getting what I'm actually entitled to. What you think you're entitled to, my mother corrected. Maya, these legal battles can go on for years. They cost enormous amounts of money, and most of the time, nobody wins except the lawyers. I could hear the coaching in her words, the talking points that Victoria had probably given her to use in this conversation. My sister understood that I might not listen to her directly, but I might be swayed by parental pressure and family loyalty. Mom, whose side are you on? I'm not on anyone's side. I'm trying to protect both my daughters from making terrible mistakes. What mistake is Victoria making? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Well, she's not making a mistake. She's trying to resolve this situation before it gets out of hand. So I'm the only one making a mistake. Maya, you're risking everything on a legal case you might not win, against people who have resources you can't imagine. Even if you're right about these papers, even if you have some legitimate claim, the cost of proving it could bankrupt you. I'm working with a lawyer on contingency. I don't pay unless we win. And what happens if you lose? What happens to your relationship with Victoria? What happens to our family? There it was. The heart of my mother's concern. Not whether I was right or wrong, not whether I deserved justice, but whether my pursuit of that justice would disrupt the family harmony that depended on everyone staying in their assigned roles. What about my relationship with Victoria now? I asked. What about the family harmony when she spends every holiday reminding me that I'm a failure? She doesn't mean it that way. Yes, she does. And you know she does. My mother was quiet for a long time, and I could almost hear her trying to find a way to defend Victoria without acknowledging the years of casual cruelty that we all pretended not to notice. Maya, I'm asking you to think very carefully about what you're doing. Sometimes the cost of being right is higher than the cost of being wrong. And sometimes the cost of staying quiet is higher than the cost of speaking up. I hung up before she could respond, but I knew the conversation wasn't over. This was just the opening salvo in what would probably be weeks of family pressure, designed to convince me to abandon my case and accept whatever settlement Victoria was willing to offer. The calls continued throughout the week. My father, awkward and uncomfortable with confrontation, tried to appeal to my sense of family loyalty. My uncle, Victoria's godfather, called to lecture me about the dangers of greed and the importance of knowing my place. Even my grandmother, my mother's mother, called from her assisted living facility to tell me that family disputes never ended well for anyone. But the most revealing call came from Victoria herself, 3 days after our lunch at the Ishi, Heathman. Her voice was different this time, harder and more professional, like she was reading from a script prepared by her legal team. Maya, I'm calling to inform you that Morrison & Associates has decided to file a countersuit alleging harassment, attempted extortion, and abuse of legal process. The words hit like a physical blow, even though David Chen had warned me that this was a possibility. Extortion? Your refusal to accept a reasonable settlement offer, combined with your threats to pursue baseless legal claims, constitutes an attempt to extract money through intimidation and false pretenses. My threats? Victoria, I filed a legitimate lawsuit based on documented evidence. Evidence that our legal team believes is either forged or misrepresented. We have experts examining the documents you claim support your case, and we're confident that they'll find significant problems with their authenticity. The accusation of forgery was new, and it struck deeper than I had expected. Victoria wasn't just questioning my legal claim anymore. She was questioning my honesty, my integrity, my fundamental character. You know those documents are real. I know you want them to be real. But wanting something doesn't make it true, Maya. And filing frivolous lawsuits against innocent parties is a serious matter that can have criminal as well as civil consequences. criminal consequences. Victoria was threatening me with jail time, suggesting that my pursuit of what I believed to be my legal rights could result in prosecution for fraud or extortion. Is that what you really think? I asked. That I forged 60-year-old legal documents and hired a lawyer to file a fraudulent lawsuit, all to extort money from your firm? I think you're desperate and you're not thinking clearly. I think you found some old papers that you don't fully understand, and you're gambling everything on a case that's going to destroy your life. Or maybe I found proof that your firm has been built on property that doesn't entirely belong to them, and you're scared that the truth is going to come out. Victoria's laugh was cold and professional. Maya, if you think a struggling waitress with a public defender is going to bring down one of Portland's most prestigious law firms, you're more delusional than I thought. I don't have a public defender. I have David Chen. Right, the bottom feeder working on contingency. Let me ask you something, Maya. What happens when your lawyer realizes that this case is going to cost more to litigate than he could ever hope to recover? What happens when he decides that his time is better spent on cases with actual merit? The question planted a seed of doubt that I tried to ignore. David had been confident about my case, but he had also been clear about the risks and costs involved. What if Victoria was right? What if the case was more complicated than it initially appeared? What if David decided that the potential reward wasn't worth a certain expense? I guess we'll find out, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. You will. And when you do, when you're facing bankruptcy and criminal charges and the complete destruction of what little life you've managed to build, remember that I offered you a way out. Remember that I tried to save you from yourself. She hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me alone with my doubts and the growing realization that this legal battle was going to be more brutal than I had imagined. That evening, I drove to David Chen's office, climbing the narrow staircase above the Vietnamese restaurant to the cramped space where he was working late, surrounded by law books and case files and the detritus of a legal practice built on hard work rather than inherited privilege. Victoria called me today, I told him, settling into the mismatched chair across from his desk. She said Morrison & Associates is filing a countersuit. Harassment, extortion, abuse of process. David looked up from the brief he was reviewing, his expression serious but not surprised. I've been expecting something like that. It's a standard intimidation tactic, designed to make you think twice about proceeding. She also said they have experts examining the documents, looking for evidence that they're forged. Let them look. We have the originals, we have supporting documentation, and we have a clear chain of custody. If they want to waste money on document experts, that's their prerogative. His confidence was reassuring, but I could see the concern in his eyes. The countersuit would complicate everything, adding new legal costs and potential penalties that could make victory Pyrrhic even if we won. David, are we doing the right thing? He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was weighing his words carefully. Maya, I can't make that decision for you. I can tell you that your case has merit, that the documents appear to be legitimate, and that you have legal rights that deserve to be protected. But I can't tell you whether pursuing those rights is worth the personal and financial cost that it's going to require. What would you do if you were in my situation? If I were in your situation, I'd probably be asking myself the same questions you're asking. But I'd also be remembering why I started this process in the first place. I thought about Victoria's face at the Heathman Hotel when I had torn up her check, the moment when her careful composure had cracked to reveal the fear underneath. I thought about years of casual cruelty, of being dismissed as just a waitress, of being treated like my dreams and aspirations were inherently less valuable than hers. She offered me $100,000 today, I said, double the original amount. David raised an eyebrow. When? At the end of the phone call, after she threatened me with criminal charges. She said it was her final offer, take it or face the consequences. Interesting timing. Threaten you with prosecution, then immediately offer more money. It suggests they're more worried about your case than they want you to believe. Or it suggests they're confident they can destroy me if I don't take it. Maybe. But if they were really confident, why increase the offer? Why not just proceed with the countersuit and let you learn your lesson the hard way? It was a good point, one that made me feel slightly better about my decision to reject Victoria's settlement offers. But it didn't change the fundamental question of whether I was prepared for the battle that was coming. David, what happens if we lose? If we lose, you don't owe me any attorney fees, but you might be liable for their legal costs depending on how the judge rules on their countersuit. It could be expensive. How expensive? Potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe more, depending on how long this drags out and how aggressively they litigate. The number was staggering, representing more debt than I could ever hope to repay on a waitress's salary. But it was also abstract, a hypothetical consequence that felt less real than the daily humiliation of being treated like I didn't matter. And if we win? If we win, you could be looking at millions of dollars in property value, plus damages for the years of income you should have received as a partner in the development. It could change your life in ways you can't imagine. Or it could destroy my life in ways I can't imagine. That's the nature of high-stakes litigation. The potential rewards are enormous, but so are the potential consequences. I sat in David's office for another hour, discussing strategy and timeline and the dozens of decisions that would need to be made in the coming weeks. But underneath all the legal technicalities was a simpler question. Was I willing to risk everything I had for the chance to prove that I was more than what Victoria thought I was? When I finally left David's office that night, I still didn't have a definitive answer. But I knew that I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Victoria had spent years making me feel small, making me believe that my place in the world was fixed and unchangeable. The lawsuit was my chance to prove her wrong, to show that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who hold the power to change everything. The next morning, I woke up to find a certified letter slipped under my apartment door. Inside was a formal legal document, thick and intimidating, filed by Morrison and Associates in the United States District Court for the District of Oregon. The countersuit Victoria had threatened, now official and terrifying in its specificity. But attached to the back of the legal filing, almost as an afterthought, was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. The handwriting was elegant, precise, unmistakably Victoria's. "Maya," it read, "this is your last chance. Call me before noon today, and we can still work this out privately. After noon, everything becomes public record, and there won't be any more opportunities for reasonable settlement. Don't let your pride destroy both our lives. V." I looked at the clock on my phone. It was 10:30 in the morning. In 90 minutes, whatever private negotiation might have been possible would be over, and the battle would become public, official, a matter of court records and legal proceedings that would define both our futures. I thought about calling Victoria, about ending this before it spiraled completely out of control. But then I thought about something else. The moment at the Heathman Hotel, when she had written that check with such confidence, so certain that every person had a price, and that mine was probably pretty reasonable. I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket. Then I got dressed for work, because whatever happened next, I still had tables to serve, and coffee to pour, and a life to live that didn't depend on anyone else's definition of what I was worth. At noon exactly, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "It's done. Hope it was worth it." I didn't reply. But for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. 8 months later, I stood in the marble lobby of Morrison and Associates, wearing a tailored black suit that cost more than I used to make in 3 months. The building still smelled like expensive coffee and leather furniture, but everything else had changed. The security guard who had once looked through me like I was invisible now nodded respectfully. The receptionist who used to make me wait in uncomfortable silence now smiled warmly and offered me water while I waited. I was no longer just Victoria's sister, the waitress who occasionally visited. I was Maya Chen, co-owner of the most valuable commercial property in downtown Portland. The legal battle had been brutal, exactly as David had predicted. Morrison and Associates had fought with the desperation of people who knew they were losing, filing motion after motion, challenging every document, deposing every witness they could find. They had hired the most expensive law firm in Seattle to represent them, a team of attorneys who specialized in making problems disappear through sheer legal firepower. But David Chen had been right about the strength of our case. The partnership agreement was legitimate, the property records were clear, and 60 years of avoiding the issue didn't make the Morrison family's claim any stronger. More importantly, We had discovered during the discovery process that Richard Morrison had known about the partnership all along. His father had left detailed notes about the Chen problem, as he had called it, and recommendations for dealing with it if it ever became an issue. The smoking gun had been a memorandum from 1998, written by Richard Morrison himself, acknowledging the partnership and noting that the Chen family appears to have forgotten about their interest in the property, and it may be best to let sleeping dogs lie rather than reminding them of their potential claim. When that document surfaced during depositions, Morrison and Associates' entire legal strategy, they couldn't claim ignorance of the partnership, couldn't argue that the agreement was invalid, couldn't pretend that they had acted in good faith. They had known, they had hidden it, and they had built their entire practice on property they didn't fully own. The settlement negotiations that followed were swift and comprehensive. Rather than face a jury trial that would have been a public relations disaster, Morrison and Associates agreed to buy out my family's 50% interest in the property at current market value. The final number was $23 million, plus interest, plus damages, for the decades of income we should have received as partners in the development. After David's contingency fee and taxes, I had walked away with enough money to never work again if I chose not to. But more importantly, I had walked away with something I hadn't expected: respect. The legal victory had been covered extensively in the Portland Business Journal, the legal trade publications, and even the national news as an example of how old partnerships could resurface to reshape modern business relationships. I had given interviews, been profiled in magazines, and invited to speak at legal conferences about property rights and family business disputes. But none of that felt as satisfying as walking into Morrison and Associates' office that afternoon for what would probably be my last visit to the building that had defined so much of my family's story. Victoria was waiting for me in the same conference room where she had probably made partner, where she had negotiated deals and impressed clients and built the career that had been the source of her identity for so many years. She looked older than she had 8 months earlier, the stress of the legal battle and its aftermath evident in the lines around her eyes and the careful way she held herself. "Maya," she said as I entered the room, her voice professionally neutral. "Thank you for coming." "Of course." I sat down across from her at the polished conference table, the same kind of expensive furniture that had once intimidated me but now seemed like props in a play I no longer had to watch from the audience. Victoria had requested this meeting through our lawyers, asking for a private conversation to, quote, discuss family matters and future relationships. I had almost declined, but curiosity had won out. After 8 months of communicating only through attorneys, I was interested to see what my sister wanted to say now that the legal battle was over. "I wanted to apologize," she said, the words coming out carefully, like she had practiced them, "for the things I said, the way I treated you, the assumptions I made about your motivations." I waited for her to continue, but she seemed to be finished with her prepared statement. "Is that all?" Victoria's composure flickered. "What do you mean?" "I mean, is that the extent of your apology? For the things you said during the lawsuit, or for the years of making me feel worthless before that?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table in the same nervous rhythm I remembered from our lunch at the Heathman Hotel. "Maya, I know you're angry about how I treated you in the past, but you have to understand that I never meant to hurt you. I was just trying to motivate you, to push you to achieve more." There it was, the same justification she had always used. Even now, even after everything that had happened, Victoria couldn't quite bring herself to admit that her cruelty had been cruelty, rather than some misguided form of sisterly encouragement. "How did that work out?" I asked. "What do you mean? The motivation, the pushing, did it help me achieve more?" Victoria's face flushed slightly. "Obviously not in the way I intended. No, it didn't. But it did teach me something important." "What's that?" "It taught me that the people who claim to love you can be the ones who hurt you the most. And it taught me that sometimes you have to fight for your own worth because nobody else is going to do it for you." Victoria looked down at her hands, and for a moment I saw something that might have been genuine remorse. "I'm sorry, Maya, I really am. I know I was wrong about you, wrong about what you were capable of." "You weren't wrong about what I was capable of. You were wrong about what I was worth." "I don't understand the difference." "I know. That's part of the problem. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding filling the space between us. Finally, Victoria looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. What happens now? With us, I mean. Are we ever going to be sisters again? It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself since the settlement had been finalized. The legal battle was over, the money had been distributed, and the property rights had been clarified. But the emotional damage, the years of feeling diminished and dismissed, couldn't be resolved with legal documents and financial settlements. I don't know, I said honestly. I don't know if we can go back to being sisters, and I'm not sure I want to. What do you want? I considered the question carefully. What did I want from Victoria, from our family, from the relationship that had shaped so much of my understanding of my own worth? I want you to understand that I was never your failure, I said finally. I was never your project to fix, or your cautionary tale to share with your colleagues. I was your sister, and I deserved better than to be treated like an embarrassment to the family name. Victoria nodded slowly. You did. You deserved much better. And I want you to understand that serving coffee isn't a character flaw. Working at a diner doesn't make someone less valuable than working at a law firm. The work I did was honest and necessary, and the fact that it didn't come with a corner office doesn't mean it didn't matter. I understand that now. Do you? Or do you understand it because I won $23 million in a lawsuit? Because there's a difference. Victoria was quiet for a long time, and I could see her struggling with the question I had posed. Had her attitude toward me changed because I had proven myself by her standards? Or had she genuinely reconsidered what those standards meant? I think, she said slowly, I'm still figuring that out. It wasn't the answer I had hoped for, but it was probably the most honest thing Victoria had said to me in years. Change was hard, especially changing fundamental beliefs about worth and success that had been reinforced by years of professional and social validation. Victoria, I need you to know something. I didn't pursue this lawsuit to hurt you or to get revenge for the way you treated me. I pursued it because it was the right thing to do, because our family had legal rights that deserved to be protected. But it did hurt me. It cost me my job, my reputation, my entire career. She was right. The scandal of the lawsuit had been too much for Morrison and Associates to weather. Richard Morrison had been forced to resign, several major clients had taken their business elsewhere, and the firm had ultimately dissolved 6 months after the settlement. Victoria had been blacklisted from most of the major law firms in Portland, a consequence of being associated with the property dispute, even though she had been an unwitting participant. I'm sorry about your career, I said, and I meant it. But Victoria, you built that career on property that didn't belong entirely to your firm. The fact that you didn't know about the partnership doesn't change the underlying reality. I know. Intellectually, I know you're right. But emotionally, it's hard not to feel like you chose money over family. I chose justice over silence. There's a difference. Victoria nodded, but I could see that she wasn't entirely convinced. The damage to her professional life was concrete and immediate, while the principle of justice I had fought for was abstract and philosophical. It would probably take time for her to fully understand why I had made the choices I did. What are you going to do now? She asked. I'm starting a foundation. Legal aid for people who can't afford to fight for their rights. David is going to run it, and we're going to focus on property disputes, family law, cases where big institutions try to steamroll individuals who don't have resources to fight back. Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since before the lawsuit began. That sounds like you, helping people who get overlooked. What about you? What's next? I don't know yet. I'm thinking about public interest law, maybe working for a nonprofit, something different from corporate practice. She paused, then added, something that might actually matter. We talked for another hour, carefully navigating topics that had once been landmines in our relationship. Victoria told me about the therapy she had started, the process of examining the values and assumptions that had shaped her behavior. I told her about the writing I had been doing, The book about my experience that a publisher had expressed interest in. When we finally stood to leave, Victoria hesitated by the door. Maya, do you think we'll ever be close again? Like we were when we were kids? I thought about the question, about the sister who had once braided my hair and taught me to ride a bicycle, before success and competition and family dynamics had turned us into adversaries. I don't know, I said honestly, but I think we might be able to build something new. Something based on who we are now, rather than who we were then. I'd like that. So would I. We hugged awkwardly, the embrace of two people who were still learning how to relate to each other outside the roles they had played for so many years. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't reconciliation in any complete sense, but it was a beginning, a recognition that we were both different people than we had been when this all started. As I walked out of Morrison & Associates for the last time, past the marble lobby and the expensive furnishings that had once represented everything I thought I couldn't have, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not vindication, not even satisfaction. I felt peace. The waitress who had served coffee and wiped down tables was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth, independent of anyone else's definition. The sister who had accepted cruelty as the price of family membership was gone, replaced by someone who demanded respect as a basic human right. I had won more than a lawsuit. I had won myself back. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.